North Haven welcomed winter earlier than usual. As the town bustled with preparations for the Christmas concert, a 10-year-old girl named Elira disappeared from the orphanage, carrying a broken violin bow and her late twin brother's worn shoes. At a quiet farm on the outskirts, an aging German shepherd named Aska suddenly let out a long howl, then dashed into the snowstorm, guiding his former handler through fading footprints and whispering pines. At the base of a frozen tree, they found Elira whispering what she thought might be her final words. That night inside an abandoned cabin, 3 lives, a man, a child, and a dog, survived the coldest night of the year with nothing but body heat, quiet presence, and a lullaby once shared between siblings. What did the old dog hear that no one else could? And what made Elira lift her violin again? Snow began to fall early Monday morning, 4 days ahead of the forecast. Soft white flakes settled quietly across the slanted rooftops of North Haven, a small town where the old pine tree in front of City Hall was always the first name spoken when the holiday season arrived. From the second-story window of the children's dormitory, Elira sat motionless on a wooden chair. Her legs curled beneath an ash-gray wool dress, her hands clutching a worn object, a faded pair of silver-gray canvas shoes. They called them the twin shoes. The room's heater had been turned off for morning assembly downstairs. But Elira hadn't gone. She remained by the window, forehead pressed to the fogged-up glass eyes, following the freshly erected pine tree in the south courtyard. The grown-ups were busy stringing lights. Laughter rang out, mingled with playful shouts. Younger children huddled together under the eaves, giggling and reaching out to catch snowflakes with their mittens. Elira blinked slowly, then whispered the first words she had spoken that day. If he were still alive, would they still have put up this tree? The question floated into the silence light as a feather drifting through falling snow. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, nor did she expect a reply. The words left her lips as if they had to be spoken before the day could go on, as if they carried the last trace of warmth from something that used to mean everything, now no longer within her reach. The shoes belonged to her little brother, old but always clean. They had once left twin prints beside her own at every piano practice. Just last month, the two of them had sat side by side on the long wooden bench in the music room, playing their own version of the Snow Waltz, even though one of Elira's violin strings had loosened. Her brother would always smile, tilt his head toward her, sometimes tapping his foot in rhythm, wearing those gray shoes. Now only one shadow remained, a half that would never return. A cold draft slipped through the window frame, causing the curtains to sway gently. Elira didn't move. Her eyes weren't dry, but they held a quiet depth. Underneath them lingered faint circles, like the color of an unfinished night leftover from dreams that never reached their end. Beneath the rug lay a broken violin bow, neatly placed beside the chair leg. She hadn't touched it since the memorial service. A soft knock came before the door creaked open. Mrs. Marlowe, the dorm supervisor, peeked in. Her eyes, though kind, showed no surprise. She was familiar with this scene. She didn't ask any questions. She just placed a neatly folded cream sweater on the armrest and said gently, "It's colder today than usual. When you're ready, come down and eat with the others." Then she quietly stepped back out. No pressure, no coaxing. Elira stayed where she was a while longer. The sky outside brightened. Snow had covered the pine tree. She noticed one strand of lights had been left dangling near the top, swinging slightly, as if searching for a hand to finish the job. The world outside felt suspended, like a painting left unfinished, but still put on display for the holidays. Beneath the snow, Elira knew her brother's footprints remained. Just 3 weeks ago, in that very courtyard, the two of them had played tag before heading to their last class together. Elira had run ahead, her brother chasing behind the soft thudding of worn rubber soles, tapping out their own rhythm. When they found him, after the accident at the lake, the shoes were still on his feet. She looked down at her palms. In the soft morning light, the tiny shoes seemed like something misplaced by time, fragile and unchanged. They had once been washed, folded, placed inside a box. But last night, Elira had quietly opened that box and brought them back to her room. She hadn't told anyone. Her hands held the shoes tighter. A small motion, but one that carried more than anyone could measure. A delivery truck reversed into the courtyard. Likely supplies from the church. Wreaths and a welcome sign reading, "Season of Hope." Children rushed out in excitement. From a balcony on the first floor, a flute began to play. Probably Joshua, the older boy, practicing for the concert. Elira didn't move, but her eyes shifted, drawn to the sound. She didn't cover her ears. She didn't shut her eyes. She listened, as if the music might reach something buried deep inside. Under the rug, the broken bow still waited, and outside the tree stood nearly complete, missing only its star. Something stirred, but had no name yet. Elira exhaled, soft and barely audible. And for the first time in weeks, she placed the tiny shoes carefully on her lap, adjusting them as if waiting for someone to return and slip them on. At that same moment, on the edge of the North Haven woods, a German shepherd stood on the wooden porch of an old brick house, ears perked, eyes fixed toward town, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. The brick house nestled beneath the slope of Frostwood Hill, where snow-covered roads saw no footprints after 8 p.m. The porch creaked whenever wind swept through the pines, carrying the scent of damp needles and the slow fall of heavy snow branches. Lying just in front of the door, a German shepherd with black and brown fur rested with his head on his front paws, his gaze locked on the path that led back toward North Haven. Aska. They once called him the soul of the Highland Rescue Unit. 6 years in the northern mountains, 4 search and recovery operations in temperatures below 15 degrees and twice. He had led children out of ravines by himself. But now Aska simply lay there, silent like a breathing log. He was retired, just like his handler. Beck sat near the window, carving a piece of firewood, sleeves rolled up to reveal long scars etched across his right arm. He sat on a low stool fireplace, light casting strips of brightness and shadow across his face like the contour lines of an old terrain map. Beside him, a cup of tea had gone cold. And above them on the wall hung an old photograph, the rescue team from that year, with the caption, "Gray Snow Unit, 6/7/2016. Beck had been their commander. A year ago, during a mission at Willoughby Ridge, they were dispatched to find a missing hiking group lost to a snowslide. When the signal came through, Beck was the first to descend. The terrain was unstable, so he motioned the others to wait while he assessed the ice shelf. But just as they began setting up ropes, a 10-year-old boy slipped from the ledge. They were only 3 steps apart. But in a storm, where the wind screams and snow blinds, 3 steps is forever. Beck returned to North Haven after the incident, quietly. No farewell ceremony, no medals. The local paper printed just a single line. The unit did everything they could under dangerous conditions. Beck cut ties with the service. No one came to ask further questions, except Aska, who still followed him home, who still woke before dawn, to lie by the front door as if waiting for a signal no one would ever give. Inside the brick house, time seemed to stop. Beck didn't hang a new calendar. He moved through the day guided by light, splitting wood, simmering soup, logging weather notes, checking the narrow forest trail into Frostwood. At a glance, these actions might seem meaningless, but to Beck they were anchors, ways to keep from dissolving into memory. He had never told anyone what really happened at Willoughby Ridge. The official reports were only a few cold sentences, but every time the weather turned, every time snow began to fall at dusk, his body jolted awake. And always it was Aska who appeared at his side, unmoving eyes calm as if already knowing everything, asking nothing. Aska didn't bark. He didn't wag at unfamiliar noises, but his ears always pivoted toward the wind. His eyes blinked with the rhythm of the forest, as if he still held a role no one had assigned, and he was still carrying it out. That afternoon, the snow fell thicker. Beck stood inside the woodshed watching the main road. A large truck passed by its tires, carving dark streaks through the fresh white. It was a delivery from town carrying the massive Christmas tree for the square. Beck watched it fade into the distance, then turned back inside. His hand brushed against the old nameplate on the shelf, Beck Grayson, Rescue Unit 4. He picked it up, paused, then gently slid it into a drawer. That chapter had been folded away, even if no one called him a hero anymore. Beck still kept his habits, checking the compass and flashlight batteries, every sunset keeping a rescue harness hung by the door with a faded medical pouch beneath it. Night settled by 6:30. In the kitchen, Beck stirred a pot of hot onion soup and ladled it into 2 bowls. One for him, one for Aska. Even though the dog rarely ate dinner, Beck always prepared both as if honoring a quiet ritual that helped time feel steady. When he placed the bowl on the porch, Aska remained in his usual position, facing town. Snow had begun to settle gently along his back layer by layer like whispers of frost. His ears twitched slightly at the sound of footsteps, then went still. Beck sat beside him, arms folded, eyes fixed in the same direction. In the distance, the town glowed with Christmas lights. Closer, the snow was falling, thick, soundless, and cold, like words left unsaid. And somewhere inside that glowing town, there stood a pine tree, missing its final star. That same night on the 2nd floor of the children's dormitory, a young girl sat by the window, clutching a small pair of shoes. While on the porch, Aska lifted his head ever so slightly, as if hearing something faint, distant, but just strong enough to make him open his eyes and look through the snowfall. The first note rang out at 4 p.m., a brief passage from Carol of the Bells echoing through the 1st-floor hallway of North Haven's dormitory. The wooden stairs hummed with the vibration of digital drums while violins and flutes tangled together like colorful yarn woven by hurried hands. It was the 3rd full rehearsal of the student choir and orchestra before the Christmas concert that weekend. Teachers, social workers, and a few foster families were expected to attend. Along the hallway, newly installed golden lights glowed gently. Posters lined the walls. Painted handprints of the children with words like, "Season of hope, we're listening for Christmas, and music connects us." Elira stood tucked beside the music room door, hands buried in the pockets of her light gray coat. Eyes fixed on the small stage inside, where everyone was busy arranging instruments and running sound checks. She had arrived at 3:40, earlier than even the music teacher. But no one noticed. Elira didn't enter. She remained in the shadowy corner where the lights hadn't reached. Inside her coat, she still held her old violin bow. Though its joint was broken, she brought it anyway, as if quietly hoping someone might ask, "Do you want to try again?" But none of the sounds inside called her name. On the platform, Joshua, the 8th grader appointed as music lead, held a tiny baton counting rhythm with quick glances across the room. Beside him, Ivy, the oldest violinist in the group, tightened her strings, her hair pulled high, and her lips curled in a crooked smile. "Instruments are almost ready," Joshua called. "Anyone who hasn't signed up for a solo, let me know before 6. Elira lowered her head. She had signed up. Before the memorial, just a week ago, her name had still been listed for a solo performance of In the Bleak Midwinter. But after the news about her brother spread, it was quietly erased. No explanation. A group of classmates passed her in the hallway, dressed in bright red sweaters, holding cookies and glitter-covered cards. One of them, Amy, paused, caught sight of Elira over her shoulder, then deliberately stepped back. "Oh, I thought she didn't play music anymore," Amy said aloud. Elira didn't react, but her hand clenched tighter around the broken bow inside her coat pocket. The music picked up again, this time a rehearsal for the choir. Childlike voices blended with an electric piano, each note trembling slightly as if still learning how to speak through the cold. Elira tilted her head gently, her eyes landing on something behind the stage. Her brother's violin. It was still there, intact, upright on its rack. She stepped forward, then again. But before she could reach the threshold, a hand reached out to block her. "Ivy, what are you doing?" she asked, voice neutral but her eyes sharp. Elira opened her mouth, wanted to say she only came to get the violin, that she just wanted to hear it again. But the words didn't make it. Before she could speak, Ivy stepped back and plucked the broken bow from her hand. "This," Ivy said, holding it up and inspecting it with disdain. "Why are you still keeping this?" Then, without warning, she tossed it onto the tile floor of the music room. The sound echoed, sharp, jarring, like the snapping of something that had once been gentle. No one in the room laughed, but no one stopped her either. Ivy bent down, eyes locked on Elira. "The girl who got her own brother killed still wants to play music," she whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. But not the teachers. Elira froze. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Fingers paused mid-strum. The music fractured, falling in scattered notes like crumbs at a cold window pane. Elira's eyes dropped to the bow, lying crooked at her feet. Its wood chipped, only a few warped strands of string still clinging to the grip. Then she turned away. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was the sound inside her chest skipping a beat. Like that bow, the only thing that once held her close to music, to her brother, had just been thrown away like forgotten trash. She walked straight through the hallway without looking back. The light above cast soft beams on her shoulder, dusted with snow. And the moment Elira stepped through the front doors, a gust of wind swept in, carrying with it a distant sound from the edge of town, a howl echoing faintly from the woods. No one else heard it, but Elira did. She stopped for a heartbeat, her head tilted slightly, like there was something in that sound calling her. At the far end of town, on the porch of the old brick house beneath Frostwood Hill, Aska stood up. The wind from the valley stirred his ears. His gaze locked toward town, as if he'd heard something beyond the human world, yet undeniably real to a creature born to listen with instinct. When someone finally noticed Elira was gone, it was 8:37 p.m. Night had settled thick over the dorm roof, and a slim crescent moon peeked through patches of gray cloud. The music room lights had been turned off. The halls had returned to their hush, broken only by the soft knocking of wind against the long window panes at the stairwell. It was Mrs. Marlowe who first noticed the empty bed. The blanket still held the shape of her body warmth, not yet faded. Her folded blue pajamas lay at the foot of the bed, just as they did every night. But Elira, the quiet shadow from rehearsal, had vanished without leaving a note. Mrs. Marlowe called the music teacher, then the coordinator for the Christmas concert. And finally, with fingers trembling on her shawl, she picked up the phone and dialed the local police. Chief McCullen answered on the second ring. His voice was groggy, tinged with irritation. "This is the second time this week, Mrs. Marlowe," he muttered. "Kids these days just want attention." "But this one's different," she said, her grip tightening. "She didn't bring a bag or a coat. And she's not like the ones who want to be noticed. She's too quiet. There was a pause on the other end, a sigh. Then the chief said he'd send someone to check, but insisted it was probably just a mild rebellion after a tense rehearsal. She's probably just sneaked out to get some air, he added. She'll be back before midnight. But Elira had gone farther than that. She'd left the dorm through the side exit that led to the old garage, where the door never latched right, its hinges long worn. Through that crack lay a narrow path that passed the broken garden fence buried under snow. Elira didn't run. She walked, slowly, holding two things close to her chest, the broken violin bow and a small pair of cloth shoes. The dormitory lights faded behind her. Ahead, the town of North Haven rested at the foot of the hill, glowing amber under rows of Christmas lights that lined Main Street. Music from the square still echoed, the chorus of Silent Night repeating in soft clock-like rhythm. But each step Elira took carried her further from that circle of light. She crossed a wooden footbridge over a frozen creek, moved along the edge of the old livestock yard. The snow grew deeper beneath her feet. Bare branches scraped her sleeves, leaving faint red scratches. Still, she didn't stop. Every other sound blurred in her mind, except the one from earlier when the bough hit the floor. She still heard it, like a broken song on loop, playing again and again inside her memory. By the time the edge of the woods came into view, the lights from town had all but disappeared. The trail ahead was buried in white. Wind hissed through the pine tops, creating a hush that sounded like whispers in a dream. Elira paused, looking up at the gray, starless sky. She pulled one of the little shoes from her coat pocket and placed it in her palm. She stared at it, like she was talking to someone invisible. "If you were still alive, would you follow me?" she asked quietly, speaking to the empty space between the black trunks ahead. Cold wind slipped beneath her collar. The broken bow tapped softly against her leg with every step. Elira didn't look back. Each footfall took her deeper into the forest, where light didn't reach, where no one had spoken her name since earlier that afternoon. No one. At 9:12 p.m., Mrs. Marlowe returned to Elira's room once more. She turned on the light and scanned the drawings pinned across the walls. Half of them were crayon sketches of two children holding hands, one with braided hair, the other wearing a beanie. On the desk sat a wax pastel portrait of a violin with tiny wings behind it, as if trying to fly off the sheet music that had never been finished. Outside, the wind howled, and the snow kept falling, thicker. Across town, Beck was pouring warm water when Aska suddenly lunged to his feet. The dog sprang forward, racing to the porch, as if yanked by a thread no one else could see. His eyes narrowed, fixed on the dark line of forest, where a gust had just swept in, carrying a sign only creatures shaped by danger could recognize something was lost. The first howl came at 9:17 p.m., ripping through the night like a sharp blade. Under the creaking wooden roof of the brick house, Aska raised his head, neck stretched, and released a deep, haunting cry. The same sound that had once made the entire rescue unit halt in their tracks, breath held in silence. But this time the howl rose in North Haven, where snow was still falling quiet as ash over old memories. Beck dropped the cup. Porcelain shattered across the kitchen tile, hot water splashing his hand. But he didn't move to clean it. He only stood there, heart thudding, listening. That howl, it wasn't angry. It wasn't fierce. It was a call, long pleading wrapped in something too urgent to be spoken aloud. Beck ran to the door, threw it open, and let the freezing air crash against his chest like a direct hit. Aska was already gone from the porch, sprinting down the narrow slopeside trail. The snow sank under his paws, leaving a trail that cut straight toward the woods. His long tail swayed evenly, head low, following a signal that Beck couldn't yet see. He hadn't seen Aska move like this since the day they left Willoughby. For the past 3 years, Aska had been calm, almost detached from the world outside. He didn't react to sirens, didn't flinch at the scream of ambulance alarms. People had started calling him the old dog, but Beck knew that wasn't true. Aska wasn't old. He was waiting for something worthy of rising for. And tonight, that something had arrived. Beck turned back inside, heart pounding. His fingers trembled as he reached for the long gray coat hanging by the door, the same one he had worn during winter rescue missions. In the inner pocket were a crumpled terrain map, a pair of carbon-lined gloves, and 2 expired protein bars. He hadn't touched them in 3 years, but he had never thrown them away. Aska barked again, shorter, sharper urging. Beck exhaled, fastened the collar buttons, and grabbed his flashlight. He looked toward the path leading into the woods, where Aska's paw prints were already fading beneath the thickening snowfall. He stepped off the porch. Each footfall sank into the snow, creating fresh prints that lined up behind the ones Aska had left. Wind whipped across his face, stinging his eyes, but Beck didn't stop. He cut through the low pine row beside the house and found Aska waiting at the fork, where the path into town split from a smaller one that veered into the edge of the North Haven forest. The dog looked at him. He didn't bark, didn't move. He just stood there like a sentinel at a gate, waiting for someone brave enough to step through. Beck approached, placing a gentle hand on Aska's neck. His fur was thick and damp. His breathing was steady but deep, and his gaze locked onto a point in the forest Beck couldn't yet see. But something in those eyes brought back the memory of the last time Aska tracked a missing child, the same look that had made an entire rescue team follow a dog's instinct over a commander's orders. Beck looked up into the trees. The wind shifted. The moon blurred, and the snow kept falling. "Let's go," he whispered. Part command, part prayer. A phrase that hadn't passed his lips in 3 years, spoken not with ceremony, but certainty. Aska surged forward, leading the way. His steps left prints in perfect rhythm like an unnamed melody. Beck followed, flashlight sweeping across bowed trees and frost-covered branches. His blood surged, not from cold, but from instinct. That old companion every soldier learns to trust without question. On his back, the rescue coat no longer felt like a relic. It was proof. Proof that when something calls deep enough inside you, your instincts will wake the parts of you thought were buried. Beck didn't know who he was searching for, but Aska did. And into the white night toward the forest's depths, a soldier who had once disappeared into silence finally stepped forward again. Not for medals, not for praise, but for a single reason that still made him believe he could keep one more life from slipping away. Not far from there, in a pocket of misty woods, Elira sat curled between 2 dark tree trunks. The wind cut across her face. She held the tiny shoes tightly to her chest. The broken violin bow rested beside her, like a trembling memory amid the forest's hush. She shivered, not from fear, but because something was approaching, and her heart felt it, long before her ears could hear. Aska stopped suddenly in a clearing where the tall pines formed a natural crescent. The wind no longer howled but quieted, as if making room for another sound. One only those who had learned to listen with their hearts could sense. Beck dropped to one knee in the snow, steadying himself against a nearby tree. His eyes scanned the clearing. At first he saw nothing, just scattered white dotted with faint paw prints and a few soft slide marks nearly erased by wind. Aska crept toward the base of a large pine, its trunk dark with moss halfway up. Beneath it, nestled in a bed of dry leaves and fresh snow, lay a small figure, still nearly lost in the colors of earth and frost. Beck gasped and slid forward. A little girl. Her hair tangled wildly around her face, like straw strands stuck to her frozen cheeks. Her thin coat was crumpled, one arm wrapped tightly across her chest, as if guarding something. And then Beck saw it, nestled in the crook of her arm, was a small pair of cloth shoes, faded, damp, and dusted with dirt. One lace had fallen loose, half buried in the snow. "Oh, God," Beck whispered, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist. A pulse, faint, but there. He quickly unwound his scarf and wrapped it around her neck. Aska settled beside them, gently nudging her small clenched hand with his nose. He didn't bark, didn't howl, but his body coiled like a strung bow, eyes locked on the girl's pale face, unblinking. Elira, Beck whispered, unsure how he knew her name, but the word fell from his mouth like a puzzle piece snapping into place. The girl's stirred lips twitching. A thread-thin voice escaped, carried by the wind, into the vast hush around them. "I didn't want to make anyone sad anymore." Her voice was like smoke in snowfall, so faint that only someone kneeling that close could hear. But Beck heard. Every word, every breath. And it clenched something deep in his chest. "No one's sad because of you," he answered softly, his hand brushing her forehead. "Cold as a mirror left out in winter. But if you stay out here, a lot more people will be." Aska edged in closer, licking her hand with care. For the first time since they'd crossed into the forest, Beck saw his dog's eyes glassy. Not from snow, but from something deeper. Beck pulled the emergency thermal blanket from his coat pocket, the one he'd carried every day, even after he stopped being a rescuer. He spread it out and wrapped the small, trembling body in his arms. Elira still didn't open her eyes. Her breath was thin as spider silk, fluttering only when a snowflake melted softly on her nose. Without hesitation, Beck lifted her, lighter than he expected. The blanket stayed snug around her, and in her hand, the tiny cloth shoes remained as if they were part of her, something that could never be let go. "Aska, let's go," he called, and the dog immediately turned, retracing their path like a sharp arrow cutting through the dense forest. Snow kept falling. The way back now felt longer than before. But Beck's steps were steadier. He wasn't thinking. Just moving body driven by an old rhythm he hadn't felt in years. The rhythm of someone who once lived to save others. In his arms, Elira let out a faint whimper. Her body was stiff with cold, but her hand, the one holding the shoes, never loosened. Beck understood. He didn't ask anything more, because some pain needs no explanation. Some children don't need blame, only someone willing to hold them when they fall, like an unfinished song, waiting for someone patient enough to stay until the last note. Even if that note quivers so softly it's barely there. Across town, the dormitory lights were now completely out. But in the quiet of Elira's room, a teacher stepped in. She bent down and picked up a drawing that had fallen under the pillow. A picture of 2 children sitting beneath a pine tree, one holding a violin, the other cradling a pair of shoes. Both smiling. The wind howled louder as they reached the forest's edge, snow now slanting sideways, like white cloth torn from the hands of angels. Beck tightened his hold around the limp, chilled body in his arms. But the warmth of his coat wasn't enough. Elira's breathing grew fainter with each gust of wind. Only one thought remained in Beck's mind. They needed shelter, now, or all hope would slip away. Just one turn ahead, he remembered. There had been an old rescue outpost, a run-down wooden cabin in the woods, drafty windows and rusted metal roof. But once it had kept him and Aska alive through a blizzard. He didn't know if it still stood, but he ran toward it, boots sinking deep into the soft snow, flashlight trembling in his hand. Aska led the way, nose to the ground, tail twitching with every step. When he stopped at a large tree with a crooked sign hanging askew, Beck knew they were close. The cabin hid behind a curtain of trees nestled like a forgotten scar from the days when people still believed the woods could offer refuge. Beck threw his shoulder into the door. Hinges groaned, but it gave way. Wind burst in kicking dust into the beam of the flashlight. He laid Elira on the old wooden bed still covered in faded linens that the cold had preserved. Aska jumped up without waiting, curling beside her, his large back blocking the draft from the broken window. Beck lit the old stove. It didn't catch easily. His hands shook, fingers numb, but his eyes never left the small figure curled under those worn blankets. Elira whimpered again, then fell silent. He touched her forehead, colder than before, but the blood still flowed. What gave him a thread of hope was Aska's breathing, heavy, steady, like he was lending her some of his own life. Outside, the storm raged on. The roof groaned under the weight of wind and snow. Inside the cabin, in that damp and broken silence, Elira began to move her lips. She didn't open her eyes, just stirred as if caught in a dream, and spoke. A whisper, fragile as frost. That dog. Did he lose someone too? Beck held his breath. He wasn't sure if she was dreaming or awake. Aska lifted his head, ears perked. He turned to Beck, those deep eyes calm and vast like a winter lake. Beck sat down at the edge of the bed. His hand brushed the edge of the blanket over Elira's shoulder. And he spoke, slowly, quietly, as if telling it to himself. He once had a friend, a young soldier, brave, always smiling. They worked rescue missions together in the mountains, always side by side. Until one day, their team got a signal. A landslide. The dog couldn't pull his friend out in time. His voice caught. His eyes burned. He didn't howl. He didn't run. He just sat there all night, guarding the spot, until morning when they found them both. One alive, the other. He swallowed hard. After that, the dog stopped riding the rescue trucks, stopped sleeping indoors. He just sat on the porch, waiting for a voice no one else could hear. Elira didn't answer, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. Beck glanced down. The little shoes were still there, faded, frayed at the toes, soaked with snow. And suddenly he understood why she held on to them the way she did, as if they were the only part of someone she could still carry. "Elira," he whispered, unsure if she could hear. "Some songs don't need words. They live in what we carry inside." Outside, the wind calmed. Aska lay still, his breathing slow and deep. His big head rested gently over Elira's hand, a silent promise of protection. In the old cabin, warmth finally began to spread. Not from the fire, but from the fragile circle formed by a soldier who had known loss, a dog who never forgot, and a girl learning how to stay alive through the smallest things. By dawn, the wind had dissolved into fog. And when the first sunlight crept through the broken window, Elira stirred. She opened her eyes and saw herself wrapped in something both unfamiliar and unmistakably real. Life. Silent, but never gone. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the sky was shifting, from storm gray to a pale watery blue, like wet paper lit from behind. The first rays poured through the shattered panes, stretching into long beams across the blankets, catching the moment the small body beneath them moved. Elira opened her eyes. Her eyes were still heavy, blurred, and burning from the cold mist. But the very first thing Elira felt clearly was the steady breath beside her. Aska was still there, his head resting lightly on her arm, like a quiet guardian, holding her sleep in place just a little longer. When Elira parted her lips, Aska lifted his head. His ears perked up, and somehow the calm in his eyes made her feel safe. Across the room, Beck sat with his back against the wall, holding a chipped porcelain cup filled with something warm and pale like weak tea. His coat hung by the window. His hair was disheveled, his eyes ringed with fatigue. But his posture was solid, the way someone sits when they've stayed awake all night just to make sure someone else keeps breathing. "Good morning," he said, voice hoarse but gentle. "You feeling any better?" Elira only nodded slightly, then reached to stroke Aska's head. "Do they know I'm here?" she asked, eyes still not meeting Beck's. "They will soon," he replied, gaze steady on her face. "But we've got time to breathe, and if you want, time to hear a story." Elira didn't answer right away. Then she looked over. Her eyes weren't curious, just knowing. The kind of knowing that comes from someone who has lost something they can't put into words. "Did you ever lose someone?" she asked, her voice soft as falling leaves. Beck didn't answer immediately. He raised the cup, took a sip, and set it beside his leg. 3 years ago, he began, eyes fixed on the line of sunlight slicing across the snow outside. "We got a call from the northern Kellen range. Avalanche. 3 climbers, 2 adults, 1 10-year-old boy. The father was injured. The mother vanished. The kid, he was buried under the ice." Elira sat still, her breath shallow. Aska didn't move either, his eyes wide open as if listening again to something that had long since buried itself in his bones. "We arrived 30 minutes later than we should have," Beck continued. "When we finally dug him out, he was still alive." His hand reached mine. He held it so tight, like letting go meant the world would fall apart. He stopped, closed his eyes slightly, almost like he could still feel that tiny grip. But just a few minutes later, his heart stopped. I tried to bring him back. I really tried. But Elira looked down at her small hands. "I know," she whispered. "When people hold on for the last time, they don't say anything. They just squeeze." Beck turned to her. A faint smile touched his lips. Not a happy one, but the kind shaped by regret and the long learning of how to let go. "For a long time, I thought I'd killed that boy," he said, the honesty in his voice cutting through the cold. But Aska didn't believe that. From that day on, every morning he sat on the porch and looked out toward Kellen. Never barked, never howled, just waited. Elira reached over and touched Aska's back. "I think he's holding the dream for that boy." Beck nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe he's waiting for another child who still needs to be held here." Outside, the sun was rising higher. Its light bounced off the snow like thin glass. But inside the cabin, the real warmth wasn't from the sun. It came from the silent presence of 3 beings, each of whom had once slipped into their own darkness, now slowly learning how to exist again, together. Beck stood and stretched. "Well then," he said with a soft grin, "we better get this guy something to eat. He acts important, but he's really just a hungry sweetheart." Elira smiled. Just slightly. But it was real, and for the first time in months. While Beck stepped outside to gather dry wood, Elira quietly opened her backpack and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was an unfinished piece of sheet music, scribbled notes, smudged edits, and a line at the bottom that read, "Written for 2. One who left and one who stayed." She looked at the music, then over to Aska. The dog's eyes reflected the light, as if he already knew this song wasn't over yet. Afternoon passed quickly, as though even the light itself was tired from winter's grip. Inside the wooden cabin, the fire's warmth crept slowly into the cracks of the wall, dissolving the dampened shadows. Beck stoked the fire, glancing occasionally toward Elira. She had fallen asleep after their small meal, but now her body showed signs of change. Her forehead glistened with sweat. Her cheeks flushed red like windburn, but her hands and feet were still ice cold. Beck stepped closer, gently placed a hand on her brow, and let out a slow breath. The fever was climbing, hotter than that morning, a clear sign her body was struggling against cold and exhaustion. He didn't need medical gear to know. Elira was slipping into what rescue teams called the gray zone. Aska had sensed it early on. He hadn't left her side. Now, instead of lying beside her, he curled directly against her, his large body covering half of hers. When Beck lifted the blanket slightly to check her limbs, Aska raised his nose and licked her forehead, deliberately, carefully. It wasn't instinct. It was intent. It was care. "You have to stay," Beck murmured, voice close to pleading. "Don't let go now. You've come too far to disappear." Elira didn't respond. Her eyelids twitched faintly. Sweat beaded down her temples like melting frost. Beck wrapped another blanket around her, fed more wood into the fire, then placed a warm water bottle in her hands. He'd seen this before. Dozens of times, maybe more. When a body fought against the freeze and fatigue, the only thing holding it to this world was will. But Elira, the girl who carried a broken bow and a pair of old shoes through the forest. Did she still want to stay? Aska slowly lifted his head and placed his chin on her chest. His eyes closed, his breathing even. Only his nose twitched as if monitoring each fragile breath. The sun set behind the pines. Wind slipped through the window cracks, lifting ashes from the fire like drifting cinders. Then came a small sob. Beck spun around. Elira stirred. Her lips moved dry and cracking, but the sound, though faint, cut through the silence like a hymn in a chapel. "My brother." Beck froze in place. He dropped to his knees beside the bed. "Elira," he whispered. "Don't be mad at Elira." Her voice cracked, fragile like a violin string breaking against tile. That day, it was Elira who dropped the shoes. Her small hand curled in as if gripping a memory too heavy for even Beck to reach. "You haven't made anyone angry," he murmured, steadying his voice, keeping it warm. "You're here, and someone very much wants you to stay." Aska leaned in, licking Elira's forehead once more. A gesture so tender that for a moment Beck almost believed the dog had learned how to comfort like a human. And for the first time in hours, Elira leaned toward Aska, burying her face into the warmth of his thick coat, which now trembled with her shallow breathing. She didn't cry, but her shoulders shook, as if the things she had held in too long were finally melting into her breath and sweat. Beck took a soft cloth and gently wiped her face. Just when he thought she had fallen asleep again, her voice returned, low even, like water seeping through cracks in stone. "If my brother were still here, do you think I'd still hear the music?" It wasn't a question for Beck. It wasn't really a question at all. He said nothing, only watched Aska. The dog lay still, yet every fiber in his body seemed to be sharing warmth with the fragile life beside him. And in that moment, Beck understood. Some lives are kept not by medicine, not by human hands, but by the quiet breath of something that once waited too long to protect again. At dawn the next day, just as the snow began to melt at the edge of the roof, Elira opened her eyes once more. They were clearer now. Her forehead still warm, but her breathing no longer faltered. Aska was fast asleep, his head resting on her chest. Elira smiled faintly, then whispered, as if to herself, "I still hear the music, even without touching the strings." That morning in North Haven began with an unusual stillness. The sun, not yet round, was pressed flat against heavy gray clouds, casting faint white smears across the horizon. Beck sensed it the moment he woke. The air felt too dense, the silence too packed, as if snow weren't falling but pressing down in waves. He rose, stepped to the wooden door, and cracked it open, then stopped. Before him, a white wall towered up, seamless and complete. Sometime in the night, an avalanche had rolled down the slope behind the cabin, sealing their only exit. A minor snowslide. Beck exhaled, furrowed his brow. He turned toward Elira. She was resting peacefully, her skin no longer flushed, her breath steady. She wasn't fully conscious, but she'd passed the worst of the fever. Still, if they were trapped for too long, without fresh air, without water, things could quickly turn dangerous. "We've made it through worse," Beck muttered, grounding himself. He checked the firewood, low. The water reserves were down to a single canister. The food barely enough for 2 days. But what worried him most was the air. If the roof was completely buried, the oxygen in the cabin wouldn't last long. Aska approached the door. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stood there, head tilted slightly, listening to something human ears couldn't catch. Then, without hesitation, he turned, padded toward the far corner of the room, and stopped by an old storage rack. Beck narrowed his eyes. "Aska." The dog scratched lightly at the wooden floor. A hollow sound echoed beneath. An emptiness no solid floor should make. Beck stiffened. He stepped forward, knelt down. Beneath layers of dust and forgotten cloth, there was a square plank. A trap door. He'd never noticed it. Every time he'd come to this cabin, he'd stayed on the main level, assuming there was nothing below. But Aska remembered. Beck pulled the plank open. A gust of cold air hit his face, but it moved. It flowed. Fresh air, from below. Beneath the cabin was a low wooden crawl space, barely 5 feet high, carved into the hillside, once used for firewood storage and as shelter from harsh winters. It could hold them. It could keep them breathing. Aska jumped down without waiting. Elira, Beck said softly, gently shaking her shoulder. She stirred, eyes glassy but more alert than the night before. "We need to move. It's safer down there." She nodded faintly. Aska had returned, front paws resting on the steps, as if urging them on. Beck lifted her into his arms and carried her carefully down the narrow ladder. The small space was tight but dry. A few logs lay in a corner. Most importantly, in the back, a small crevice near the rock foundation let in air. A thin draft, but enough. He laid Elira on an old woven mat. Aska settled beside her again, curling tightly as if to say, "As long as I'm here, nothing worse will come." Beck lit the oil lantern and placed it high, its flickering glow painting orange shadows across the damp wood. He stood still for a long moment, then let out a soft laugh, part disbelief, part gratitude. "He doesn't wait for orders," Beck said, eyes on Aska. "He just listens, goes where he's needed." Elira turned her gaze to the dog, her fear now replaced with quiet reverence. Something inside her stirred. It wasn't words that awakened it. It was that silent act, the one that had saved her life again. "I think," she said softly, "he's telling us that sometimes the door isn't in front of us. It's under our feet." Beck nodded, and only those who watch closely ever see it. The crawl space fell into silence, but it no longer felt like a trap. They hadn't been buried. Not thanks to a being who never needed orders, only presence. An hour later, the light through the small crevice shifted, from gray-white to the softest hue of pink. A sign the sky was clearing. Beck leaned forward. "If the snow's receding, we'll climb out soon," he said gently. Elira smiled faintly, her hand still resting on Aska's back, like a companion who didn't need to speak to know the way home. That night, the little underground room became the quietest shelter for the three of them. Above, thick planks sealed out the storm. Beneath, the floor was damp and aged. And yet between the fading blankets, the dog's warm breath, the flickering lamp, and the silent rhythm of shared survival, this place had become for a moment a true home. Beck sat with his back against the wooden wall, a cup of warm water in his hands. His eyes tracing the faint glow of the lantern flickering against the low ceiling, like the last thread of light clinging to a long winter night. Elira lay nearby, wrapped tightly in 2 layers of blankets. Aska rested between them, his head gently propped on the girl's arm, tail twitching now and then whenever she shifted slightly in her half-conscious sleep. The wind outside still brushed against the narrow vent in the rock wall, but the sound had changed. No longer the sharp howling of earlier that morning. Now it sounded more like a tired lullaby, the forest humming quietly after a night of storms. After a while, Elira opened her eyes. The lantern's glow stretched across her vision, slow and soft. She didn't ask what time it was, didn't try to sit up. She simply turned her head toward Beck. "Uncle Beck," she whispered, her voice scratchy and low, like someone surfacing from a deep dream. "I'm here," he said, lifting his gaze from his thoughts. "That dog," she murmured, her hand reaching to stroke the warmth along Aska's spine. "He found me. Didn't get lost. Didn't turn away, maybe. That means—" Her voice faltered. Her eyes fluttered shut for a moment, as if the weight of her words might undo the fragile stillness around her. "Maybe I wasn't really meant to die." Beck said nothing. Aska stirred. He didn't look at either of them, only breathed slower, deeper, like the kind of night watchman who knew when to answer, not with words, but with presence. Beck set the cup aside. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, eyes fixed on the girl. Not to explain, but to affirm. "Elira," he began, voice low and steady. "I was trained to find signs of life in places people thought were gone. One time the team had to dig through a collapsed hillside. They said no one could have survived. But Aska stopped. At one spot. Just one." He paused, took a breath, nodded to himself as if the memory sat close. "And there, we found a little girl. She was holding a teddy bear. Her heart was still beating, barely. She didn't live because she had more air or some miracle. She lived because Aska knew." That same morning light crept shyly into the cellar through the crack in the stone. Not bold sunlight, but enough to reveal that the snow had receded just a little. That a new day was slowly rising from the mists. Beck was tending the makeshift fire when he looked up and saw Elira seated against the wall, her hands cradling the broken violin bow she had carried since that first night. She turned it over gently, fingers tracing the cracks, then placed her hand exactly where the strings had once stretched across. The wood was scuffed and stained, the bridge loose. But Elira looked at it as though it were alive. Something once lost that had found its way back. Aska sat beside her, half-asleep, ears still perked. He didn't interfere. He never did. He simply stayed close, the way he always did, like someone assigned to guard a breath, not a body. Beck stepped closer, about to speak, when Elira's voice came first, clear and quiet. "I want to fix it. Not to perform. Just so it still has a sound." She pulled 2 shoelaces from the pair of worn canvas shoes, her brother's shoes. The fabric was faded, the soles soft from age now, no longer fitting any living foot. She twisted the laces into even strands, then gently threaded them across the pegs. Her hands trembled from fatigue and cold, but her eyes were still, like glass that didn't ripple. Beck sat opposite her. He didn't say a word. He didn't stop her, didn't help. Because some things, some kinds of grief, can't be shared. They must be touched, held, worked through, alone. Once the shoelace strings were in place, Elira lifted the violin to her shoulder, the position she'd practiced for years in the school orchestra. Now it sat unevenly, the strings far from proper pitch. but she lifted the bow all the same, as if her muscles remembered what to do when words failed. She drew one line. The sound scraped out broken and sour, like wind moaning through a shattered pipe. Beck winced, but Elira didn't stop. She drew another stroke, softer this time, cautious, and the noise, though still off, softened at the end. Aska lifted his head. He turned toward her ears, drooping slightly, head tilted. That look. Beck had seen it before. Not curiosity, not surprise. It was the look Aska gave when he found signs of life, when he knelt beside a fallen friend. The look of knowing. Elira continued playing. There was no music sheet, no meter, no notes that matched. Just trembling strokes that rose and dipped like breath itself. The strings buzzed, some snapped mid-vibration, others faded before finishing. But the message was unmistakable. I am still here. Some notes broke mid-air, some trembled out of rhythm. But they folded into the quiet of the cellar like a voice returning from the dark. Beck sat still. He didn't think he was listening to music. He thought he was witnessing something. When a child chose to stay using the only sound she had left. Aska stepped closer. He curled beside her, resting his head gently on her knees, tail tapping faintly against the wood. Elira lowered the bow. I know it's not good, she whispered. Beck shook his head. It's not about good. It's real. Elira bowed her head over the instrument, still clutching the bow as if it held part of her broken past. My brother used to say, if the violin still makes sound, then we're still together. Beck said nothing. He lowered his gaze, first to Aska, then to Elira, the girl who had restrung a broken violin with the laces of her brother's shoes. And he knew, in that moment, that an unfinished melody had just kept a fragile life from fading. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. Through the gap in the stone, a clear shaft of sunlight broke in, sharp, undeniable, reflecting off the old wood of the violin. Elira looked up, met that beam of light, and whispered, I think I'm ready to go back. Aska let out a breath, soft, measured, as if he had known all along. A thread of amber light slipped through the cracks in the rocks just as Beck opened his eyes. He wasn't sure how long he'd drifted off. The last thing he remembered was Elira sitting with the old violin, repaired with shoelaces, playing clumsy but haunting notes that seemed to hush even time itself. Now the girl was fast asleep, her head resting on Aska's shoulder, both arms gently wrapped around the body of the instrument. Beck moved slowly, careful not to wake them. He stretched and walked toward the small gap at the back of the cellar, where the morning light had begun to crawl, and casting a pale honeytone across the wooden floor. Everything had changed. The wind was no longer howling. The snow outside no longer blurred the world into a wash of white. It formed soft ripples on the hillside like quiet waves. And the sky, for the first time in days, was beginning to rise. One breath at a time, as if the entire town of North Haven had finally stirred from a long frozen sleep. He climbed upstairs. The old wooden door creaked under the weight of ice and packed snow. Beck had to push with his shoulder to force it open. The exit was still narrow, but wide enough now for him to step through and stretch, tilting his face up into the cold blue sky. In his hand was a flare gun, an old piece he kept more out of habit than need, a remnant from the days when he was part of a rescue team. He hadn't expected to use it here. He loaded the flare, pointed it toward the only break in the tall pines, and fired. A soft pop echoed into the silence, and an orange streak slashed through the sky like an exclamation mark of hope. Beck didn't wait with anxiety. He simply went back downstairs. Elira was still asleep, truly asleep for the first time in days. Her body no longer curled into itself for warmth. Her face relaxed, her breathing steady. A strand of hair clung to her forehead, damp from the night's fever finally breaking. But what reassured Beck most was how Aska lay. Unchanged head resting on Elira's back ears, flicking gently with each shift of wind, outside eyes closed, but alert in a way only those who've stood long watch could understand. Recovery, Beck knew, doesn't always come from medicine. Sometimes it's in body heat, shared in the raw, broken strings of an instrument still trying to sing, and in the silent presence of a being who simply stays close, quietly declaring, "I'm here." He sat down and waited. Over half an hour later, the distant thump of a helicopter sliced through the air. That sound used to signal the end of life or death missions for him. But today it meant something else entirely. Something neither he nor Elira could name just yet, but both knew was drawing near. The trapdoor creaked open. Beck raised his voice a few times, signaling. Roughly 15 minutes later, the rescue team arrived. Figures in bright red jackets moving swiftly across the softened snow flashlight beams, cutting through the mist like knives. "We saw your flare," someone shouted. "Is anyone in need of assistance here?" "A little girl," Beck answered. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. They came prepared with a stretcher, emergency blankets, and fast response kits, but when they entered the cellar, they didn't rush forward. They paused, because the scene before them demanded silence. A small girl slept deeply cradled in the arms of a large German shepherd. The dog's black and tan coat was fluffed from the cold mist, but its face was calm, peaceful, in a way that hushed the room. Its ears were lowered, gently, eyes closed, as if it too understood the newcomers were friends. The rescue team leader knelt, looked at Aska, then turned to Beck. "You trained this dog well." Beck shook his head, gaze still on Elira. "I didn't train him. He just knows what to do." They lifted Elira, carefully wrapping her in insulated blankets. She stirred, eyes still closed, her small hand gripping the edge of Aska's fur. And the dog, instead of resisting, rose slowly to follow, walking beside the stretcher like a silent guardian. Beck followed behind his eyes, tracing the footprints in the melting snow. By the time they reached the top of the ridge, the sun had fully risen. Winter sunlight spilled through the treetops, lighting the path back to town. Not harsh, not brilliant, but enough to make everything visible again. Aska stayed close to the stretcher, his steps steady and sure. No one gave him orders. No one had to call. He simply knew. Someone needed to be escorted back to the light. Inside the ambulance, Elira still hadn't woken, but she no longer trembled. Her hand lay calmly on Aska's fur, and through the frost-touched glass, Beck saw her lips lift ever so slightly. A quiet smile like breath returning to a soul once lost in the snow. At the emergency entrance, the doors opened with a soft bell that echoed oddly in the still winter air. The stretcher wheels left wet tracks on the hospital floor, snow melting into long streaks like fear dissolving into time. Elira felt weightless, like a page soaked through, but the nurse whispered to Beck, "Her pulse is steady. Strong enough?" She hadn't fully regained consciousness, but her face twitched now and then, an expression that hinted she was near the surface of her dream. Beck walked with them until they reached the emergency room threshold. A nurse gently stopped him. Only medical staff beyond this point. He nodded, stepped back, and turned toward Aska. The dog had already stopped. He sat just before the red line on the tile floor. He didn't glance around, didn't fidget. He simply remained posture upright, gaze fixed on the closing door, like a sentry. Silent, devoted. The hospital was slipping into its midday quiet. Light from the tall windows cast a cold, soft glow on the floors. A few nurses walked by. Some paused to look at Aska, eyes wide in surprise, but no one asked him to leave. Somehow they all seemed to understand. This dog knew exactly where he was supposed to be. Beck walked over and sat beside him. "We wait," he whispered. Aska didn't move, but his breath came steady and deep, as if he too was anchoring himself, holding calm, not just for his own sake, but for the girl he'd followed through the storm. Inside the sterile hospital room, Elira was being carefully examined. Body temperature, blood pressure, neurological responses. The doctors spoke in low voices, nodding at times, frowning at others. But all of them understood one thing: this child had survived something far harsher than a snowstorm. She carried a wound that did not bleed, hidden somewhere between her chest and memory. Elira opened her eyes slowly. The ceiling above was a muted white. The monitor beside her bed beeped in a steady rhythm. There was no scent of snow, no whisper of violin strings, only the antiseptic stillness that clung to every hospital room like a second skin. She turned her head gently toward the frosted glass window. Beyond it, she saw a dark, unmoving silhouette. "Aska," she whispered, barely more than a movement of her lips, a breath that never fully formed. And like something buried deep within her stirred to life, her heart beat just a little faster. The EKG monitor blinked green with a sudden clarity. Out in the hallway, Beck rose from the bench at the very same moment. The door remained closed, but he looked at Aska and saw the dog's tail move. Just once, just barely, like a faint knock from someone who already knew they were being called. "She's still here," Beck said aloud, though it sounded more like a thought than a statement. Aska didn't turn around. He remained where he was. But there was something in his gaze now, something quietly lit from within. A doctor stepped out. His eyes met Aska first, then flicked toward Beck. "She's awake," he said. "Stable. We'll keep monitoring for a few more hours." Beck nodded. "Thank you, doctor." The doctor glanced again at Aska. "Are you the trainer?" "Not quite," Beck replied with a small smile. "I just walk with him." The doctor chuckled softly and walked away. Beck sat down again beside the dog. The wall behind him was cold, but sunlight had started to filter through the tall window panels, casting down two long shadows. One man, one dog, merged together on the pale hospital floor. Elira remained inside. Her heartbeat still echoed steadily, not because of machines nor medication, but because she knew. She knew that just beyond the glass, a life was waiting for her. A presence that had never turned away. No one needed to speak. Some stories, some bonds, continued to exist, to resonate, even when never spoken aloud. When the nurse finally opened the door and invited family in, Aska rose first. No commands, no leash. He walked forward on his own, toward the bed where Elira was already sitting up, smiling, as if she had been waiting for that soundless footstep all this time. News traveled faster than either Beck or Elira could have imagined. Within just 2 days of her waking, the entire town of North Haven had passed around a bold headline from the local paper: "German Shepherd finds missing girl amid snowstorm." Beneath it was a blurry photo taken from a distance, full of swirling snow, yet unmistakable: a child being lifted onto a stretcher by rescue workers, and beside her, a large black and tan boy standing tall. His head tilted slightly toward the girl, as if guarding something sacred and unseen. That morning, when Beck walked into Elira's room with a steaming cup of hot chocolate, he found 2 reporters already seated opposite the hospital bed. They were polite, their voices soft, but their excitement was barely hidden. "We're from the city's news channel," one said. "We heard this incredible story. A girl who survived the storm thanks to a retired dog. It's something many people need to hear." Elira was sitting up in bed, wrapped in a thick forest green sweater. Her hair was neatly brushed, her cheeks still pale but no longer drained. Aska lay curled at the foot of her bed, his head resting gently on her legs, just as he had every day since. A voice recorder clicked on. The reporter leaned forward slightly. "Elira," When you were lost in the snow, what made you want to keep going?" Elira was silent for a long time. Her eyes lowered to the small bracelet around her wrist, made from a frayed shoelace, the one she had tied that morning in the cellar when she played the violin. Her fingers gripped it gently. Then she looked up. "I heard barking," Elira said. Didn't know whose voice it was. Just knew someone was coming, even if they didn't know my name. The reporter smiled gently, scribbled a few lines, then asked another question. "Some say you were incredibly brave. Others mention that you ran away after a mistake. Is there anything you'd like to say to them?" Beck tightened his grip on the cup. He was about to speak, but Elira had already nodded. She looked directly into the reporter's eyes, steady, composed in a way that didn't quite belong to a child who'd just survived a blizzard. "I don't need to be forgiven," she said, each word deliberate and clear. "I just want to stay." That sentence left the room silent. No one asked anything further. That evening, the segment aired on a local television channel under a new headline, "A girl and her dog survive a deadly blizzard. But what remains is a simple sentence. I just want to stay." The image of Elira smiling softly under the hospital lights with Aska curled beneath her eyes, half closed, made its way through small online forums across town. It wasn't breaking news, but it was the kind of warmth people clung to during a long winter. Many of those who once criticized Elira, calling her the girl who caused the accident, the only survivor, began sending letters to the hospital. Some were clumsy notes written in uneven handwriting. "You were brave. I misjudged you. Sorry I never asked what you needed." Others arrived without names, just drawings of a dog standing under a snowy sky. Elira didn't write back, but she kept every letter in a wooden box by the window. Each morning as sunlight slipped into the room, she would open the box and read. Not to reply, but to remind herself somewhere out there, people too were learning how to stay. Beck sat in the corner, watching Aska lift his head every time someone knocked on the door. "Maybe you saved 2 lives, he whispered, placing a hand on the dog's head. "That little girl, and a man who once stopped believing in life." Aska gave no reply, just a gentle wag of the tail, then lowered his head again as if to say this was always how it was meant to be. Someone once asked Beck whether he had forgiven himself for that mission, for what happened all those years ago. But instead of answering, Beck looked at Aska, and now at Elira, and smiled. Because for some people, forgiveness doesn't come from apologies. It comes from an eye that still watches you when you thought no one ever would. When Beck brought Elira home from the hospital, the town of North Haven welcomed them with a windless afternoon. Along the snow-covered road, 3 sets of footprints, 2 human, 1 canine, marked a quiet return to a beginning that had no name yet, but had long been waiting in silence. The road leading to Beck's old farmhouse sat on the southern edge of town, where snow piled a little thicker and rows of pine trees stood like breathless witnesses on either side. The silver pickup truck moved slowly toward a small, slanted roof house. The wooden frame had darkened with time, but the windows remained clear, reflecting the faint light of December's fading sun. Elira sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a thick wool coat that seemed larger than her. She hadn't spoken since they left the hospital, only gazing out the window, where deer sometimes peeked through brush and crows called sharply from bare branches. But when the house appeared around the bend, something flickered in her eyes, even if just faintly. Beck gave a soft smile, turned off the engine, and glanced at her. "This is home," he said. "No stained glass windows or soft beds like the hospital, but if you want to stay for a while, it'll learn how to open its heart." Elira nodded, lips curving into a small smile. Before she could say anything, there came the sound of hurried steps from the porch. Aska. He didn't bark, didn't jump. He simply ran straight toward the truck tail, swaying in a slow rhythm, like a heartbeat after a long nap. His thick black and gold coat caught the sunlight, and his dark eyes held that familiar look Beck had seen in the most important moments of his life. When finding a survivor, saying goodbye to the lost, or needing someone to stay. Beck opened the door. Elira stepped out and froze for a second. Then she walked to the dog, knelt, and wrapped her arms around his neck. It wasn't rushed nor awkward, like it was something she had done 100 times before. This time she whispered, her head resting on Aska's back, "I'm not leaving." Beck stood behind them, watching the two figures, one small, one strong, fold into each other like the final piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Beck's wooden house wasn't large. The living room opened into the kitchen. A small window hung with earth-toned curtains, and the wooden floor creaked softly underfoot. Elira settled into an armchair by the window where she could see the backyard, where the snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of dry grass and trails Aska had worn with his morning runs. Beck placed a steaming cup of cocoa in front of her. "I used to think this place was just for me and Aska," he said, sitting nearby. "But maybe it always knew it could wait for someone else too." Elira held the mug in both hands, eyes lowered to watch the steam swirl. "How long has Aska been here? Since my last deployment," Beck replied. "He's like me. Doesn't belong where the sirens and flashing lights are anymore." Elira nodded. "He's like me," she said. "We don't have to run anymore." Beck didn't respond, just smiled quietly. In the corner, Aska lay curled up, eyes open, and watching her every movement. He didn't need commands. He asked for nothing. Just to be near the person he wanted to keep safe. That was enough. The afternoon passed slowly, like an instrumental melody without words. Beck showed Elira how to light the wood stove, and together they toasted slices of bread over the iron rack. Smoke filled the room with the scent of butter, cinnamon, and something warmer still. The kind of warmth Elira hadn't known in a long time. As the sun dipped low, Elira stepped outside into the backyard. She stood on the thin layer of snow, her boots sinking slightly, but she didn't hesitate. Aska stood beside her, pressing his head into her hand. Beck watched from the kitchen doorway, not calling out, not interrupting. Just standing still, the way Aska once had for him. Sometimes helping someone begin again doesn't require many questions. Just a quiet space where they can simply be. Alongside a dog who asks for no promises, but always keeps them. That night, when the wind picked up outside and the snow began to fall again, Elira didn't flinch. She slept in the attic room, the one Beck had always saved for a family member who never came. And at the foot of the bed, Aska lay guarding her sleep like a silent, unshakable gate that needed no lock. Mornings in early January in North Haven had a calmness to them. Snow still blanketed the paths, but the sun climbed higher now, casting soft golden lines through the windows. In Beck's attic room, a sound rang out, clumsy, determined, by the window. Elira was practicing. The old bow, once cracked at the joint, had been repaired by a friend of Beck's in town. The violin wasn't perfect, but it worked. Her small fingers were remembering how to create sound again. The new strings weren't perfectly balanced, and the wooden body still held its scars, like her own, which she never meant to erase. Aska lay beneath the table, half dozing. Each time Elira paused, he lifted his head, as if urging her on. She no longer held tension in her shoulders. Her breath moved with the bow, and sometimes as she played, she smiled. Softly, but truly. The town's rehearsal for the winter concert was held at the Cultural Center, a cream-painted brick building in the square. When Beck brought Elira in, the long benches were already filled with chattering kids and parents. Everyone greeted Beck with a nod, and their eyes on Elira were different now. The story of the dog who saved her from the blizzard had traveled far, but the shift in how they looked at her wasn't born from pity. It came from quiet respect for a girl who had found her way back to the world with crooked notes and unflinching eyes. Elira had been invited to join the final orchestral rehearsal. She wasn't a lead, just a supporting spot in the second row. But to her, that was more than enough. "Aska can come too, right?" she asked before stepping on the stage. Beck nodded, patting the dog's back. "He's already got a seat waiting for him right behind the curtain." Aska followed the stage manager slowly, then settled beside the pulled-back red velvet curtain. He didn't bark, didn't move, just looked toward the stage, where the first notes of the violin began to rise. Bathed in the soft golden glow of the auditorium, Elira sat upright, guiding the bow gently across each printed note. At first her hands trembled, but after a few measures, everything seemed to ease into a rhythm long forgotten. Her eyes no longer looked down. They looked forward steady. Backstage, Aska lifted his head slightly, as if listening more closely now. And in a moment, no one else noticed the dog tilted his head and gently tapped his tail against the wooden floor. At the end of the piece, Elira leaned slightly with the final pull of the bow. As the last low note faded, she exhaled quietly, then turned to the player beside her, smiling. That smile was answered like a silent understanding that the music wasn't just a performance, but a quiet declaration. "I'm still here, and I want to lend my voice." As she stepped off the stage, she ran straight to Aska. Unbothered by the watching crowd, she knelt and wrapped her arms around his neck. "I did it," she whispered, "and this time I truly feel happy." Aska wagged his tail. That afternoon, Beck and Elira left the community center just as the sun leaned west. The fading light poured through tall windows, casting long shadows on the pavement. Children still played in the rear field, their laughter echoing into the sky. Elira paused, watching for a while, then turned to Beck. "I think I'm ready to go back to school." Beck didn't say anything, just gave a quiet nod. In his eyes, something softened, like the last patches of old snow melting away, making space for a new season. Aska stepped between them. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of fresh earth, aged wood, and the distant echo of notes that hadn't yet flown far. Sometimes, to help a child smile again, there's no need for applause, just a listener who stays, and a dog waiting quietly backstage. That night, Elira brought her old violin into her room. She took the shoelace once stretched into a string and tied it into a bracelet. Then she looked at Aska lying peacefully on the floor and said softly, "Tomorrow we'll visit a place where he used to play beneath the sun." The official night of the winter concert came on January 22nd. The day snow returned after 2 weeks of clear skies. North Haven's town square sparkled with light. Red ribbons hung across white columns, and every seat in the grand hall filled up nearly an hour before the program began. Backstage, Elira sat alone in a quiet corner, her dark-toned violin resting gently across her lap. She wore a simple velvet dress in deep earth brown, the collar lined with white trim. Her long hair was tied in a low bun. Her gaze no longer wavered. There was a quiet depth in her expression, like someone who had learned to listen to the wind before ever drawing a bow. The piece she chose tonight wasn't in the original program. She'd asked to include it, just a brief interlude titled "For What Was Lost." No one questioned her choice. Only Beck knew. Inside Elira's coat pocket was a faded pair of small blue shoes, placed there earlier like a silent guest who would walk the stage beside her. Aska waited at the wing. In the muted backstage light, the dog remained still, ears raised, eyes tracking every movement from behind the curtain, as if he'd stood watch in too many places gone silent from loss. Then it was Elira's turn. The hall hushed as she stepped out from behind the velvet curtain. No introduction, none needed. Everyone here knew her. Not just as the girl who survived a snowstorm, but as someone trying each day to live again from what had once fallen apart. She stood at center stage, lifted her violin, closed her eyes for a single breath, and drew the bow. The first note rose like a whisper of wind across an old porch. Then came a series of quiet, steady tones. Not perfectly tuned, not flawless, but unmistakable. It was a lullaby, one only a child could have heard from the hands of a sibling. It was the song she used to play with her little brother each Christmas night, the two of them sitting at the foot of their bed, tapping spoons on tin cans, singing in voices still untouched by time, mischievous and warm. Now Elira played it again, wordless. Yet in every phrase and glissando, there was a retelling of someone who once held a hand and now was learning to let go without losing herself. The hall faded into silence. No one coughed. No one whispered. Adults clutched their children's hands. Children leaned quietly into their parents' shoulders. And somewhere amid the crowd, once skeptical eyes began to blur in the haze of unspoken understanding. Each phrase seemed to pass through their hearts, reminding them of things unsaid, of people gone, and of the fragile yet persistent presence of those who remain. Backstage, Aska raised his head. His eyes glistened in the golden stage lights. He didn't bark, didn't step forward, but his entire body leaned toward the music, where the life of a young girl was now unfolding not in words, but in presence and memory. As if Aska too was listening, as if he understood that this song wasn't for the ones who were lost, but for the ones still here, still learning to walk with the shadow of those they had loved most. When the last note faded, Elira remained still. 1 second, 2. Then the entire hall rose to their feet. There were no loud cheers, just gentle clapping, steady, full, and sincere. Someone in the middle row whispered, "Thank you." No one knew exactly who they were thanking, but the words carried something far greater than music. Elira bowed, then turned toward the wings. Aska was already there. Without a command, he stepped out and walked beside her, back into the quiet behind the stage. After the concert, Beck waited outside the hall. Snow had just begun to fall again, thin and delicate like a veil drifting over the rooftops. Elira emerged, violin still cradled in her arms. She looked up and murmured, "I think my brother heard it tonight." Beck placed a hand on her shoulder. The yellow glow of the streetlight lit her hair, her bracelet woven from an old shoelace. He said nothing. But Aska came close, gently pressing his head against her knee, as if to say, he heard it too. The song of those who remain didn't always need a crowd. Sometimes it only took one person willing to listen, one dog that never strayed too far, and one fragile soul brave enough to raise her voice in the middle of winter. On the way home, Elira dozed off in the car, her head resting gently against the window. Aska lay quietly in the back seat, eyes fixed on the sleeping girl. And in her dream, Elira saw tiny feet running through spring grass, laughter echoing behind her, as if someone had called her name just one more time. Morning in North Haven arrived with mist blanketing the hills and a sun still too shy to warm the chill. Inside the little wooden house on the edge of town, the fireplace crackled gently, spreading the scent of cinnamon and oatmeal through the rooms. Elira sat curled up in a blanket near the hearth, her small feet tucked beneath her. Her eyes were focused on the sketch paper in front of her, a charcoal pencil leaving soft smudges on her fingers. But she didn't mind. She was drawing Aska, curled up asleep, paws, tucked muzzle resting against the rug. At the kitchen table, Beck was hunched over a stack of neatly clipped papers, forms all filled out. Beside them was an old silver fountain pen, still smooth in its flow despite the years. He was working on the final section, the part without a template, reason for adoption. He glanced out the window at the faint paw prints left in the melting snow, then brought the pen back to paper and began writing. I am not trying to replace anyone. I am not her father, and she doesn't need me to be. But when she wrapped her arms around my dog that night and whispered, I'm not going anywhere, I understood what she needs is someone who stays, especially when the snow begins to fall again. He paused, then added one last line. I used to fall asleep next to a bottle every night trying to forget the child I couldn't save. Now I wake up before dawn to cook oatmeal for a child I want to keep no matter what it takes. He closed the folder, slipped it into its cardboard sleeve, and poured another cup of hot water. The coffee didn't taste as bitter anymore. Or maybe it was his heart that had changed. That afternoon, Beck visited the town's social services office. The building was a small 2-story house covered in ivy. At her desk, Melissa, the caseworker, peered over her delicate-rimmed glasses with a kind smile and a look she didn't quite manage to hide. I read your file, she said softly, and that handwritten line at the end. To be honest, this is the first time I've seen someone talk about keeping a child by admitting they're not perfect. Beck gave a quiet nod. He didn't need approval, just understanding. He needed them to know that this decision wasn't rooted in pity. It was rooted in faith. In the way Elira had looked back that evening, walked off stage hand in paw with Aska without ever turning around. Melissa tapped the file lightly. It'll take about 2 weeks to complete the initial process. During that time, she stays with you under legal temporary guardianship. Beck nodded again. No problem. We're still learning how to live together. That night, Elira sat cross-legged on the armchair by the window, flipping through an old photo book Beck had pulled from storage. She was pasting in new pictures, her and Aska in the snowy backyard, a quiet forest path, and a small photo of her and Beck reading sheet music side by side. When Beck set down a cup of tea, she looked up. Uncle Beck? Were you really sad once? Beck looked at her. He nodded. No avoidance, no sugarcoating. There were nights, he said, when it felt like drowning in cold water. Drinking didn't help. Nothing did. Elira looked down at the floor, at Aska, asleep ears twitching slightly whenever she moved. And now Beck smiled faintly, pouring more tea. Now, someone eats the burnt toast I make in the morning. Someone needs warm milk, and there's a dog who guards the door without a sound. Elira smiled. It wasn't wide, it didn't gleam, but it was real. So real it warmed the whole room with a light that couldn't be kindled by fire. That night, as the wind picked up and snow began to fall in quiet flakes, Beck stood by the window. He remembered the long evenings when the only glow came from a bottle in his hand, when no one asked if he was asleep, when the house felt like an echo chamber of things lost. But from upstairs came Elira's voice. Uncle, can we go to the woods tomorrow? Where the big pine tree is? Beck answered. Tomorrow's sunny, let's go. No more clinking glass, no more collapsed shadows over the kitchen table. Only the soft breathing of a sleeping child, and the sound of a dog's paws tapping lightly across the wooden floor, like the steady beat of a heart no longer wandering. The next morning, Elira wrote something on a small scrap of paper. She folded it in half and slipped it into the wooden box where Beck used to keep old letters. When Aska came to lie beside her, she whispered, If someone ever gets lost and finds this place, there'll still be a message waiting. The first spring morning in North Haven brought a different kind of air. As if the world had chosen to breathe slower, to hold on to each gentle moment a little longer. The mist didn't hang like it did in winter. It faded quickly from the rooftops, Leftover patches of snow melted into clear trickles, sliding down the edges of the porch. On Beck's front porch, a long bench had been pushed close to the wooden rail. Elira sat there, her feet brushing the cool tiles. On her lap rested her old violin, now almost fully repaired. The paint still peeled in spots, and hairline cracks remained etched into the wood, but the sound was clearer than ever. She played. Not fast, not complicated. Just a series of simple melodies she had once learned long ago. The spring breeze rustled through the pine trees behind the house, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and newly split wood. No one clapped. There was no stage. But here she was, performing for 2 listeners. And that was all she needed. Aska lay beside the bench close to Elira. The golden morning light shimmered across his black and tan fur. His ears flicked gently with every change in tone. And each time the bow paused, he shifted his head like he was listening for something deeper than music. Maybe he didn't understand every note. But he felt what pulsed in the girl's hands. A steady rhythm, certain and alive, like life itself, had just remembered how to return. Beck sat quietly on the back step a few feet behind her. He didn't interrupt the music, didn't call out. In his hands was a cup of tea still gently steaming, and in his eyes, something both still and deeply grateful. He looked ahead, toward the spot where sound, breath, and light wove into one, and gave a silent nod. So many winters had passed, buried under the hush of memory, before he realized pain doesn't need to disappear to become bearable. Sometimes it only needs to be shared, to be remembered gently in the soft notes of a song, and that's enough for it to feel lighter. Elira ended the melody with a drawn-out glissando, then exhaled slowly, like letting go of a thin veil of smoke. She glanced down at the old guitar, letting her fingers trace the wood grain, like saying thank you to a companion who had walked with her through every rough and winding path. Then she turned to look at Aska, the German shepherd still lying beside her, eyes seeming brighter in the sunlight. Elira reached out and stroked the top of his head, whispering softly, "It's sunny today. But even if it snows again tomorrow, I'll still be here, still playing, still watching you lie there like this." Aska tilted his head, his left ear flicking slightly, like a quiet agreement. He never needed a command. He never had. Because wherever he chose to lie down was always the place he intended to stay, as if guarding a silent promise. Beck set his tea down on the step and walked over. He sat beside Elira without saying a word. Didn't interrupt her moment with the dog. Didn't try to explain the silence. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the edge of the woods, where so many things had changed their lives forever. Elira leaned gently against his shoulder. A breeze swept across the backyard, lifting the last few golden leaves clinging to the season. Birds had begun to return, chirping softly in the trees, almost like they knew the cold was finally retreating. And yet, in that warm hush, no one forgot that winter had been here. And now, the 3 of them. One man who had lost his way, one girl who had misplaced her childhood, and one dog who once looked toward a name no one called, sat together in a shared moment. No words were needed, no promises required, just presence, long enough, close enough, to warm each other from the inside. Next to the guitar, taped gently to the wood, was a small piece of paper. The handwriting was slightly slanted but clear. There are souls who only need one place to return to, and one chance to rest under gentle light. The spring breeze lifted the edge of the note but didn't carry it away. It remained there, like a song that had ended, yet left its echo on fingertips, at the corners of eyes, and in a heart that no longer closed itself off. Not everyone is born into a perfect family or a place they can call home. But sometimes in the white silence of snow and the long pauses of life, a flicker of warmth is rekindled by the smallest of things. A nod, a quiet nuzzle to the forehead, or the heat of a soul lying beside you without needing to be called. German shepherds, like Aska in this story, are more than intelligent, loyal dogs. They are symbols of unwavering presence, of silent instincts that know how to stay with the broken until healing has the space to begin. These dogs never promise anything, never ask for anything. Yet they are the finest listeners, the invisible embrace that allows a wounded heart to open again. The story of Elira and Aska is not just one of survival. It is one of restoration. It reminds us that no one needs to be strong alone, that every soul, even shattered ones, can find light again if someone chooses to stay. And sometimes the love we share with a dog, simple, steady, unspoken, is the very tether that pulls us back into life. If you've ever loved a dog, ever held them when you couldn't cry with anyone else, then maybe you already understand some songs don't need to be sung aloud to echo forever. They live on in a look, a tail's gentle wag, and a love that never leaves.